Good day and welcome to this lecture. Today we engage with one of the two most important challenges that is confronting the international order in the 21st century. One of it is obviously the rise of cyber conflict and the emergence of climate challenge as a driver of geopolitical tension. While these two phenomena may appear distinct in their origins and mechanisms, they are deeply intertwined in their implications for global stability. Together, they represent what scholars term as non-traditional security threats that are challenges that defy the classical Westphalian logic of state-centric, territorially bounded conflict and demand new analytical frameworks. Now, this lecture is organized around three broad sections or divisions. First of all, we will examine its challenges individually, unpacking its strategic logic, its empirical record and the theoretical debates that it generates within the discipline. Next, we will explore the intersections and compound dynamics between cyber conflict and climate induced tension. And third, and the last, will situate both within the broader question of the future trajectory of global peace, examining whether the international system possesses the institutional capacity and the political will to manage this kind of challenges. Now, coming to the first slide, that is conceptual framing of these issues that you are facing today. Let us begin with the domain of cyber conflict first. Cyberspace as a fifth domain of warfare alongside land, sea, air and space. It represents one of the most profound structural shifts in the architecture of international security since the nuclear revolution of the mid-20th century. Yet, despite its centrality to contemporary strategic competition, cyber conflict remains analytically contested. There is no universally accepted definition of cyber war, and significant disagreement that persists about whether large-scale cyber operations constitutes acts of war in the classical sense or whether they occupy an ambitious or very ambiguous space beneath the threshold of armed conflict. The scholarship of Thomas Reid, for instance, has argued proactively that cyber operations are better understood as extensions of traditional coercive tools, that is sabotage, espionage, subversion, rather than a genuinely novel form of or separate form of warfare. In contrast, scholars such as John Archila and Richard Clarke have emphasized the transformative potential of cyber operation to deliver strategic effects that is comparable to kinetic military force. Now, this debate has direct consequences for development of international law, deterrence doctrine and attribution policy. What is empirically clear is that the state-sponsored cyber operations have become a routine instrument of strategic competition. The 2007 distributed denial of service attacks against the Estonian government and the financial structure there widely attributes to the Russian affiliated actors. That also constitutes one of the first cases in which cyber operations were employed as a tool of political coercion against a sovereign state. The 2010 Starknest operation in this context is also a very important example, which was a sophisticated piece of malware jointly attributed to the US and Israel, demonstrated for the first time that cyber weapons could cause physical destruction to critical infrastructure, and in these instances, the infrastructure was centrifuged at Iran Natanz nuclear facility. Now, these cases established a precedent that cyberspace is a domain in which states pursue strategic objectives through covert means, often deliberately exploiting the ambiguity of attribution to mainly plausible deniability. Coming to the next, what are the key dimensions of this conflict? The strategic logic of cyber conflict is shaped by several distinctive features that differentiate it from conventional military competitions. First, there is the problem of attribution, the technical and political difficulty of identifying the perpetrator of a cyber operation. This asymmetry between offensive capability and defensive accountability creates powerful incentives for aggressive state behavior, since the cost of being identified are often lower than the benefits of a successful operation. Second, the cyber operations are characterized by their reversibility and scalability. They can be calibrated to produce effects ranging from temporary disruption to permanent destruction. Now, allowing states to apply graduated pressure without triggering the escalatory dynamics that attend military action. Third, and perhaps the most significant one, the offense-defense balance in cyberspace appears to be favoring the attackers, a structural characteristic with profound implication for strategic stability. The concept of deterrence, which provides the intellectual scaffolding for Cold War strategic stability, does not translate easily into the cyber domain. Nuclear deterrence rested on the credibility of retaliation, the centrality of attribution, and the devastating finality of nuclear exchange. None of these conditions obtain or is a reality in case of cyberspace. The result is what many scholars describe as condition of persistent low-level conflict or a gray zone of strategic competition that falls short of open warfare but steadily erodes the institutional and infrastructural foundations of a state power. Coming to the next slide, that is what is the international law associated with it. The governance dimension of cyber conflict is equally fraught. The Tallinn Manual, produced by the NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, has attempted to apply existing international humanitarian law to cyber operation, a valuable scholarly exercise, but one that lacks binding legal authority and is contested by major cyber powers, including China and Russia. The UN group of governmental experts has made this incremental progress towards establishing voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. But this remains non-binding and fundamentally, disagreements persist about sovereignty, the right of states to regulate the domestic internet, and the applicability of the laws of armed conflict to cyber operations. The structural divergence between Western conception of a free and open global internet and the Chinese-Russian model of cyber sovereignty that represents a fracture in the normative architecture of global cyber governance that has direct implication for the stability of the international order. Coming to the next, that is how climate is a threat multiplier. We turn now to our the second major challenge, having already discussed the cyberspace. Climate change is a driver of geopolitical tension and potentially of violent conflict, as we see nowadays. The relationship between climate change and security has evolved considerably as an area of scholarly inquiry. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the field was dominated by relatively linear environmental scarcity models, associated primarily with the work of Thomas Dixon, which argued that the resource scarcity induced by environmental degradation would directly increase the likelihood of violent conflict, particularly in the developing world. Now, subsequent empirical research has complicated the picture considerably. The relationship between climate variables and conflict on site has proved to be highly context dependent, mediated by institutional capability and capacity and political economy and also social cohesion. The more sophisticated contemporary framework understands climate change as a threat multiplier, which is a concept that endorsed by the United States Department of Defense, the UN Security Council, and numerous strategic studies institutions. This framework holds that the climate change does not cause conflict directly, but rather it exacerbates the existing vulnerabilities. It also intensifies the resource competition, also degrades the state capacity and increases the probability of pre-existing tensions to escalate into violence. The implications of this framework for strategic analysis are very significant. It directs attention not only to the biophysical parameters of climate change, but to the political, institutional and social conditions that determine whether climate stressors translate into security outcomes. Coming to the next, that is climate and how it is related to migration and state fragility. Several empirical domains illustrate that these dynamics with particular clarity. The first is the water security. Fresh water scarcity project, as we have seen over the time, that is projected to worsen significantly under all mainstream climate scenarios. It is also a significant source of tension in several regions. Whether it's the Nile Basin, the Mekong River system and the Indus Basin, these are all sites of overlapping sovereignty claims and upstreaming, downstreaming asymmetries. And also competing national development priorities that climate change will render increasingly acute. The absence of robust multilateral water sharing agreements in several of these basins, combined with the strategic importance of water for agriculture and domestic consumption in densely populated downstream states, it represents a significant risk of interstate tension. Even if the likelihood of formal interstate war over water remains deliberate in the literature, or it might be a debated topic, but it still holds a lot of significance for the same. The second domain is the climate-induced displacement and migration. The World Bank's ground truth report, along with analysis from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, projects potentially very large-scale climate-related displacement in coming decades, driven by sea level rise, extreme heat events, and the degradation of agricultural productivity. Climate displacement is already a political flashpoint in several regional contexts, including the Sahel, South Asia, and the Pacific. The relationship between migration and conflict is complex and contested. Migration is not inherently destabilizing. And under conditions of effective governance and economic integration, migrants can contribute positively to the whole society. However, under conditions of pre-existing political fragility, ethnic tension or resource competition, large-scale migration flows can serve as a catalyst for violence and political instability. Let's try to understand the geopolitics of the energy transition. The third domain, and arguably the most strategically complex, concerns that the geopolitical implications of the energy transition. The global transition away from the fossil fuels, if it is proceeds at the pace demanded by climate science, will produce profound shifts in the distribution of geopolitical power. States whose strategic weight, derives primarily from the hydrocarbons exports face the prospect of structural economic decline, with potentially destabilizing consequences for both domestic politics and regional order. At the same time, the transition to renewable energy introduces new sources competitions for lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements and the other critical minerals essential to clean energy technologies. Now, these new resource dependencies create new vectors of strategic competition, supply chain vulnerability and potential conflict in future. The Arctic is a particularly instructive case in this case. As climate change reduces Arctic sea ice, the region is becoming simultaneously more economically accessible and more strategically contested. Russia, US, Canada, Norway and Denmark all have overlapping territorial claims and strategic interest in the Arctic. And the pace of climate change is overturning the development of appropriate governance frameworks. The Arctic Council, while a valuable forum for scientific cooperation and dialogue, it lacks the legal authority and enforcement mechanism to manage the full range of strategic tension that climate change is generating in that region. Let's try to understand the convergence of cyberspace and climate. Having examined each of the challenges individually, we must now consider their intersections, the ways in which cyber conflict and climate-induced tensions interact, compound each other, and collectively shape the strategic environment in which future global peace must be maintained and constructed. The most direct intersection concerns the critical infrastructure protection in an era of climate stress. Climate change is increasingly the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events, whether it's hurricanes, flood, then wildfires, then heat waves that place extraordinary stress on the physical infrastructure upon which the modern societies depend, whether it's power grids, water treatment facilities, communication networks, financial systems, and so on. Now, this same infrastructure is increasingly vulnerable to cyber attack also. The convergence of physical climate stress, and the cyber vulnerability that creates a compounding risk. Adversaries may exploit, moments of climate-induced disruption to conduct cyber operations against already weakened infrastructure, amplifying the harm and complicating attribution. The strategic implication of the convergence have received insufficient attention in both the academic literature and in policy circle. Coming to the next, a second intersection concerns the political economy of climate adaptation and the securitization of climate response. As climate stress intensifies, governments face mounting pressure to devote resources to adaptation of seawalls or drought-resistant agriculture, early warning system, or managed retreat from high-risk areas. This pressure may crowd out investment in other security domains, including cyber defense, particularly in lower income states with limited fiscal capacity. Now, this result is a structural vulnerability. The states most exposed to climate risk are frequently also those with the least capacity to defend their digital infrastructure. Now, this creates the opportunities for the external actor, both states and non-state actors, to exploit the digital vulnerability in moments of climate-induced political fragility. A third and more speculative but analytically important intersection concerns the potential for climate change to disrupt the power distribution underlying the current international order in ways that create windows for strategic opportunity or desperation for revisionist states. Now, if climate change disproportionately degrades the political position of certain major states, while others are better insulated by geography, technological capability, or institutional resilience, the resulting shift in the balance of power may create incentives for preventive action, alliance restructuring, or the exploitation of asymmetric tools, including cyber operations, by states seeking to navigate the changing strategic environment. Coming to the next theoretical framework for global peace section, and then the implication for global peace. We now arrive at the central normative and analytical question of this lecture, that what do these emerging challenges mean for the future of global peace? Now, this question requires us to be precise about what we mean by global peace. Now, in Kantian tradition, perpetual peace is conceived as a cosmopolitan achievement, a condition sustained by republican governance, international law, and commercial interdependence. In the more sober Glottian tradition, peace is understood as the managed coexistence of sovereign states under a framework of shared rules and institutions. In the realist tradition, peace is largely, epiphenomenal, a temporary condition that produced by favorable configurations of power that exist, and most notably the stabilizing influence of hegemony or bipolar balance. The challenges examined in this lecture sits uneasily within all three of these frameworks. Cyber conflict and climate induced tensions are not amenable to the classical instruments of peace, military deterrence or territorial treaties and diplomatic congruences in any straightforward sense. They demand instead institutional innovation, normative development and forms of international cooperation that must be sustained across profound differences of interest, ideology and relative power. Coming to the next, the institutional architecture of the contemporary international order constructed in the aftermath of the Second World War and substantially consolidated during the post-Cold War liberal movement. It was designed primarily to manage interstate military conflict. Now, the UN Security Council, NATO, the NPT regime, and the bilateral arms control architectures were built around the threat of organized military violence between sovereign states. They are poorly equipped to manage the diffuse, multi-actor, and technically complex challenges of cyber conflict and climate change. The Security Council has struggled to develop a coherent approach to either of these domains. Veto politics, divergent national interest, and the structural limitations of unanimity-based decision-making have consistently frustrated collective action. The voluntary, non-binding character of both the cyber norms negotiation and the Paris Agreement on climate change reflects the limit of what current international system can sustain in terms of binding enforcement or for international cooperation. What pathway can be taken for the stability? Coming to the next. Yet pessimism should be tempered by a recognition of considerable adaptive capability that has been demonstrated in other domains of international cooperation. Also, the evolution of nuclear non-proliferation regime, imperfect and under strain as it is today, it demonstrates that the international society is capable of constructing and maintaining complex governance architecture around the genuinely existential risk. Now, the relatively rapid development of international norms around chemical and biological weapons and the emergence of the responsibility to protect the doctrine as a contested but real addition to the normative vocabulary of international society. It suggests that the international order is not structurally incapable of normative evolution. The question is whether that evolution can proceed at the pace required by the urgency of these emerging challenges. Several scholars and policy analysts have advanced proposals for institutional innovation specifically tailored to the challenges of cyber conflict and climate change. On the cyber side, this includes the proposals for dedicated international cybersecurity agency, which is analogous in some respects to the International Atomic Energy Agency, with the mandate to set standards, conduct verification, and facilitate incident responses. On the climate side, proposals for enhanced climate security functions within the UN system, including a dedicated Climate Security Council, have gained traction in some circles. Even if their realization remains politically distant, what is clear is that the management of both the challenges requires moving beyond voluntary, self-reporting mechanisms towards institutions with genuine monitoring, verification, and ultimately enforcement capability. Coming to the non-state actors, technology, and global governance. The role of non-state actors and civil society deserves particular emphasis in this. Both the cyber conflict and climate change are domains in which non-state actors, technology corporations, civil society organizations, scientific community, and transnational advocacy networks play roles of substantial strategic importance. The governance of these challenges cannot be achieved by states alone, and the effective multilateral frameworks will need to incorporate these actors in meaningful ways. The experience of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has successfully institutionalized the relationship between scientific expertise and policy deliberation across profound political differences, offers a partial mode for how epistemic communities can contribute to the management of complex transnational risk. Coming to the end of this lecture, that how our integrated security framework can be maintained. Cyber conflict and climate-induced tensions represent a structurally novel category of security challenge, one that is diffused rather than discrete, transboundary rather than territorial, and long wave rather than episodic. The challenge, the analytical frameworks and the institutional architecture, the normative consequences upon which the post-1945 been constructed. The post-1945 international order has been constructed. And they interact in ways that compound their individual efforts, creating conditions of chronic stability or chronic strategic instability that are poorly captured by the conventional security analysis. The future trajectory of global peace will be shaped in very significant measures by the capability of the international system to develop adequate responses to these challenges. That capacity is not predetermined. The outline or the outcome will depend on the quality of intellectual analysis brought to bear on these problems, which is precisely the task to which you as a student of this subject are being trained to contribute. But also on the political choices of the state, the agency of the international institutions, and the normative commitments of the international society as a whole requires. There is no assured path to stability, but there is a clear analytical interpretive to understand these challenges rigorously, to examine their intersection honestly, and to develop the institutional imagination which is required to build governance framework that is commensurate with the scale of risks they represent. That is the enduring task of the strategic studies in the coming century. Now, in the next slide, these are the few readings that you can refer to understand the topic better. And with this, we conclude our lecture. Thank you for your time.